brought forward over and over again in recent weeks. So it's much in the news. Bharat Mata is much in the news these days and has turned into a kind of provocation, a kind of bait, a proof, as though one were required to say Bharat Mata ki Jai as proof of one's loyalty to the nation. The explicit demand, victory to Mother India, clearly even Jai Hind will not do anymore. The most visible of those who are being so baited and even attacked are Muslims, some of whom have refused to chant the slogan. And just the day before yesterday in the news, there was a news of a man whose arm was in fact broken by people in his own locality for this new quote-unquote crime, and people so you have pictures of him in hospital with a broken arm. Muslims have said that it goes against their religion to be seen to revere the nation in the form of a god or goddess. Today's newspaper report, in fact, tells us that now a fatwa has gone out forbidding Muslims to chant this slogan. So the question I want to raise here with all of you is, what are our stakes as feminists? Should we have a problem? And why? Why should Indian women's freedoms be at risk if our nation is now being imaged as a woman, and that too as a mother? Indeed, why not make her our icon? Mothers, as we know only too well, suffer under patriarchy, living out lives of sacrifice and service to husbands, children, elders, and anyone else. And however well they may be treated, women give more than they get. And mothers are the quintessential illustration of this fundamental form of exploitation and subordination. So then what could be better than to elevate this figure to respect, the kind of respect accorded to the nation, and above all to a victorious one? So let us not dismiss this kind of question as mere empty sloganeering by a hate-filled right wing. My short answer to this set of questions is quite simple. The slogan and the figure it refers to is quite simply profoundly anti-feminist. But it's not enough in this day to give short, quick answers. We have to undertake the ideological labor of providing longer ones. And the one I'm going to present here comes in two parts. The first part being historical, and the other coming more to contemporary times. So the historical time that I'm going to go back to, which is the time when in fact the Mother India, the Bharat Mata icon was put together in the first place, takes us back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries in colonial times in India, the times of social reform, the times of nationalism, and the relationship between these two, which were always uneasy, if not in tension with each other. There was nothing uncommon in the fact that the early nationalists of the 19th century produced a figure of the Mother India figure, using this symbol as a symbol for freedom from colonial rule, that the sons were going to fight for the mother against the British. In fact, the figure of Mother India, the mother figure has been the most typical kind of nationalist figure across the world. The fatherland, the idea of a father figure, in fact, is more of an oddity. Nazi Germany being one of the few countries that produced the idea of a fatherland rather than a motherland. But what made the Indian situation probably unique is that Hindu cultural nationalists in the late 19th century were actually experimenting with different kinds of figures in their battle with the British, in their attempts to produce a highly gendered icon for the future nation. One such was the child wife, since a girl was commonly being married at a very young age, even below 10 years. And this was the figure of the child, often evoked as a cute figure, as the young doll, the little doll playing with her things even as she is being married. This was put forth as an essential aspect of Hindu indissoluble infant marriage. This was set up as an icon vis-a-vis the British. Revivalist nationalists created an idea, therefore, of Indian culture built around this domestic figure that would be ours, precisely because it was not being touched either by British colonialism or by its laws. Hence, their complete opposition to any kind of social reform, and there was a massive movement of social reform during this period, spanning both Western and Eastern India, cutting across from Malabari, Jyotiba Phule, all the way to reformers in colonial Bengal, who wished to raise the age of marriage from 10 to 12 years. And this found utter and complete opposition on the part of these cultural nationalists. But it was only because of a much publicized case of marital rape when a young girl bled to death in 1890 due to violent sexual intercourse that she was forcibly subjected to by her older husband, that this carefully guarded image of infant marriage fell apart. So militant nationalism, in other words, had to then make room for social reform only under these circumstances. But one of the consequences of this was that then there was a deliberate shift to a very different icon, one that was less vulnerable to that, one that was unlike the young child in a potentially violent household. A new icon was fashioned, a very public, militant icon, which is precisely the kind of public Bharat Mata figure that we are all very acquainted with. So a deliberate move away from the child wife within the home. And the consequences of that, however, for social reform were devastating, because it was an effort to shut down, to close down what had been an entire century worth of efforts of social reform on the cause, which all centered on women, marriage, childhood, and so on. This was shut down with this new public abstracted figure of Bharat Mata. And this, in fact, is what we might call the prehistory of the women's movement in India and feminism in India. There's a further twist in this remarkable history, which took place barely two decades later, that is in the 1920s. Mother India, and I'm now speaking about the English term Mother India, was the title of a book that was published by Catherine Mayo, an American journalist, in 1926. And this book, or tract, if one wants to call it that, was one of the most sensationalist publications of its times. It sold millions of copies, was translated into dozens of languages, and became the center of a massive imperial controversy and storm. What made it so sensational? It claimed to be a book about the state of public health in India and used hodgepodge accounts of the Indian people's illiteracy, ignorance, superstitions, sexual practices, that they were uncontrollable, and so on and so on, and with the young wife being at the heart of the problem. All of this, according to Mayo, was deliberate, willfully promoted by a degenerate Hindu religion. This was the sum and substance of her book. Such people, Mayo went on to argue, were clearly not fit for any kind of political independence and therefore required the ongoing tutelage of the British. So now you can see why a book like this would set off such a storm. As you can imagine, this text produced massive outrage on the part of most nationalists who debunked it, who protested that it was false, who vilified it, and so on. Gandhi himself famously called it the Drain Inspector's Report, and however added that everybody should read it nonetheless. It was the first generation of feminists, the feminist nationalists of the 1920s, who offered a somewhat different reading of this book. Yes, they said, women in India are definitely at a disadvantage. Yes, they said, the age of 12 that had been just raised from 10 to 12, that age of marriage is much too low and in fact needs to be raised at least to 14. But they turned the tables on imperial interests and alignments by arguing that it was the British, not Indians, not Hindu religion. It was the British who were the biggest obstacles in their very efforts at social reform. It was they who were blocking their efforts to raise the age of marriage in the Sharda Act that finally then came into being in 1927. There were others, such as leaders of the non-Brahmin movement in Madras, who were quite ready to take Catherine Mayo literally, to use her openly and directly, to say openly, in fact, there was nothing false in what she was saying. She was, in fact, telling it like it is. She was opening up the truths of Indian social life to the public world, to the international society. And in fact, one of them, Ayamuthu, thanks Miss Mayo openly and says, thank you for having brought these bitter truths, these ugly truths out into the open, and attacked those who were in turn vilifying Mayo. So in other words, what I'm trying to get you to understand in terms of this historic period is that these very decades, which were the decades of the active production of this icon called Bharat Mata in India's colonial past, were the very years of the open, direct contestation over women, women's rights, and their futures. The increasingly strident and militant goddess Bharat Mata adorned all kinds of maps of the future India, whether with sons, without nationalist sons, in ways, however, that directly delegitimized reformist agendas around women. And these reformist agendas could be liberal, they could be anti-casteist, they could be feminist. So this is my first kind of moment that I want to share with you here, which is to say, this is the way in which an icon, a seemingly benign icon, in fact participates in, and in fact delegitimizes, shuts down what was in fact the history of the women's movement or the history of feminism in India. Let me now just jump forwards almost a century later, when Bharat Mata has made this now, the present time that we are in now, when Bharat Mata has made this very sudden comeback, or so it seems. And in this context, I have to say, I'm just thinking out loud with you. In the previous section, I'm relying on the work of other historians, people like Tonika Sarkar, Mrinalini Sinha. There's a great deal of work now on the way in which the Bharat Mata icon was put together and the larger colonial imperial context within which it happened. We are much worse off in trying to understand what is happening today. We feel much more overwhelmed by what is going on today. And I am one of those people who almost never champions conspiracy theories. It's not my favorite theory. I think it's a lazy theory. But I do have to wonder why there is so much belligerence being attached to this particular slogan above all others in the current dispensation. And so I can't believe that the use of this slogan is completely arbitrary. It is happening at a time of unprecedented visibility where feminist issues are concerned and where women in public life are concerned. And especially, I would say, post-December 2012, the gang rape, there has been a kind of hyper-visibility, you could say almost, to certain ways in which women and feminist issues are now taking up public space. More interestingly, especially in terms of why today universities have become such a focus of the people in power, in that particular context, I am particularly interested in the fact that we're in an unprecedented situation when it comes to thinking of the social composition of our students. It is happening at a time when women students are almost, practically to all intents and purposes, half our student bodies on average. That is to say, the official figure is about 46% as of the year 2012-13, which is practically parity, I mean, barring a few percentage points. And this is completely unprecedented. I would like you just for a pause for a moment and think of any other public institutional space in our country today. Think of anyone and ask yourself, what is the presence of women there? Let's think of our assemblies and parliament. What are the figures? They've been stagnating around 5 to 10% maximum, yes? And those figures haven't been changing. Think of our workplaces. I don't know if you're aware. Are you aware of what proportion of women are in our workplaces? The total number of women who have any kind of paid work in our country, across urban and rural India, is 15%, 1-5. It's 15%. We are one of the lowest countries in the world when it comes to work participation for women. The only country that's worse than us is Saudi Arabia. And I don't think we feel any better for being slightly better than Saudi Arabia. Okay? So I'm genuinely asking, what spaces are there in our public institutions within which there is anything close to a significant presence of women? And the only answer we can come up with is higher education. It's the only space. Our colleges and universities are the only space where we see very large numbers there. And this is unprecedented. This has never happened. This is also unprecedented in terms of the moment that one is in. So I'll just give you a little bit of a context for thinking about this really new moment in the history of higher education in India. Because if we go back to the time of independence, we look at the total number of people, young people in any kind of higher educational institution, it was about 1 lakh students. This is in 1947. This is UGC figures. If we move now to 2012-13, that number has jumped to 34.3 million. 1 lakh PhD students alone. Okay? That's the kind of jump we're talking about. And that means that we are the second largest such system in the world when it comes to our university and college system. Much of this growth, by the way, has been happening. It hasn't been happening like continuously. In fact, this even more surprising thing, much of this growth has been happening in the last 20 years, and there's been a doubling in enrollments in the last decade alone. It's now about 24 to 25%, which means that 1 in 4 students, a young person across the country, and this is both urban and rural, 1 in 4 young person in the age group of 18 to 23 is now in some kind of institution, most commonly an undergraduate college. So just think about this. And what makes this to me so extraordinary is that these are the very years that have seen the growth in privatization as never before. So think about the fact of this kind of expansion happening at a time of galloping privatization. 75% of colleges in India today are private. Okay? Add to this, even more to my mind, mind-boggling, is the fact that with growing privatization, we have had growing democratization. In other words, till about, I don't know, about 30 years ago or so, in public universities, especially cities like Delhi, it was normal for the student who occupied any kind of significant space in higher education to be urban, middle class, upper caste, and male. This was ordinary, normal, went without saying, right? So once again, let's look at what has been happening in the last 10, 20 years. At the time of independence, barely out of that 1 lakh, you remember I mentioned, 10% out of that 1 lakh, that's about 10,000, were women. There were 10,000 women in higher education at that time. Today, as I said, it's 46%. Just think of this amazing jump. And again, the biggest jump has been in this last period, in these last 20 years or so. And it's not just a jump in gender. So there's this huge gender jump, but there's also a more interesting combination, an intersectional kind of quality to the whole question, if we look at caste, if we look at class, if we look at region. Because if you take 100 out of 100% of all students, then roughly about 34% are OBC, about 13.1% are scheduled caste, 4.6% are scheduled tribe, 32% are OBC. This leaves about, and this we can clearly say is thanks to reservations. Out of this 100, the remaining is 4.2% are Muslims and about 2% minorities, which leaves about 43% upper caste. So I'm giving you this picture because we do feel very strongly that we have seen democratization happen. We feel very proud of the fact that in, say, universities like Hyderabad Central University, like JNU, we have seen a new kind of student enter higher education in ways that are not true before, especially in terms of caste and class. And I am part of those who sort of celebrates this kind of democratization. But let's remember that it remains a distorted and incomplete one. Because if only 4% out of this 100 are Muslim, and that number, by the way, very shockingly has been declining. Unlike all the others that have been rising, this figure has been declining. All right, so this means that there is something nonetheless distorted, incomplete in this very democratization process. But it does remain the fact that 46% across all groups, whether it be Dalit, whether it be upper caste, whether it be Hindu, whether it be Muslim, across all these groups, an almost equal number of young women are also fighting their way in, are also entering this space. So even in intersectional terms, there is something remarkable happening. So this is the first kind of public presence, one that we don't talk about enough, it seems to me. It's a kind of silent revolution, I often say, in terms of this kind of public visible presence in universities and colleges today. But women are not simply only present. Women are active in multiple struggles, often providing leadership on issues that are not simply or narrowly only quote-unquote women's issues. More than ever before, we now know that there can be no azadi for some putative, homogeneous group called women. Upper caste feminists have recognized very belatedly, no doubt, very insufficiently, that the battle to end patriarchy will never advance without fighting caste. It's one that we have learned the hard way, not one that we have welcomed with any great effort on our part, but it is one that we are nonetheless learning and learning well. Feminists have also been critiquing the Indian path of neoliberalism for having rendered women workers the worst victims. And in fact, the most common route, given my figure of 15% that I gave you earlier, and the very low levels of work participation rates, the Indian route of neoliberalism is simply or crudely one of outright exclusion of the vast majority of women from this new workforce. Feminists, as we all know, and I don't need to belabor this, especially here in JNU, where so many of you are active on so many fronts, they have been building solidarities across movements. Think about queer rights and think about the long campaign to try and try and repeal Section 377. Think of the battle over land and resources. During these very weeks when all this has been going on in HCU and in JNU, many districts in Chhattisgarh have been witnesses to one of the worst crackdowns in the history of that state. You all know about Soni Sori's case. She spoke here, I think, a week or two ago, and described to you very vividly the kind of torture that she and her family are being put through. But at this point in time, at this very time, in fact, in the last few days, we have been getting news over and over again from our friends and comrades in these areas that people are being hounded, people are being driven out of their homes, people are being put into arrest without any cause. In these journalists, researchers, lawyers, and most of them, many of them in fact, are women. And I'm not even getting into the large number, very visibly large number of activists from the women's movement who have been responsible for laying out the contours and for fighting back our rape culture. This has been happening with increased force and visibility in the last few years. And this is a culture which by no means, many people in public life would think that this culture is somehow only confined to the slums, to the margins of us, to the detritus, so to say, of our society. But I think we now know better. It knows no boundaries. It, in fact, is being perpetrated by people occupying the highest offices of our land. In my view, what I'm trying to get at with all these examples, in my view, this makes feminism and its modes of dissent something dangerous to the powers that be. And universities are seen as the harbingers of this danger, along with left and anti-caste movements. We feminists may not have a slogan like Jai Bhim or Lal Salam. We don't have any flags, but we are very much here. And at the same time, I would suggest, I'm not asking that we now get a flag, that we get a slogan. That's not my point at all. In fact, we don't really need any special markers of identification beyond a visible politics that brings feminism closer to other movements of equality and freedom. Let me come back to the Bharat Mata figure and and let me just quickly say why I find it particularly frightening on two counts. On the one hand, as I've been trying to demonstrate, it overtly and directly closes off any feminist demand for changing the status quo. After all, the only possible orientation to this figure is one of worship, not justice. On the other hand, and this is something I would like us to think about, by rendering the territory of India as equivalent to the contours of a female body, it renders impossible any questioning of this territory, its borders and boundaries especially, because any such questioning would amount to nothing less than a dismembering of the mother figure herself, the body of the mother, and no more base act is conceivable. Notice therefore also, this is why this figure I think is so potent today and why it is being evoked with such force, and notice therefore that a slogan like Jai Hind will simply not do that kind of ideological work. So, yes indeed, we have a critical job to do in explaining both historically and in the present why Bharat Mata is no benevolent figure of women's empowerment. Her victory, on the contrary, would spell the death of feminist struggle. But this does not mean that we carry out the equivalent of, it just struck me with today's news, we cannot now carry out something like a feminist fatwa. This would completely undermine our politics, which is one of persuasion, not command. In other words, and this is something I would also like to think with you about, feminism is not a religion. There is no feminist divinity that stands above or beyond us and our world, no set of beliefs that have religious sanction and are therefore beyond question and must command our assent. I'm afraid that we know this, but it is more easily said than practiced, and that our earthbound politics very often approximates, as though treats feminism as a set of fixed beliefs rather than a set of deeply held convictions that carry no other guarantees other than our willingness to work and fight for them. We can and should exercise our freedom to speak or not to speak, but not in order to install an alternate deity to the one being currently forced upon us. This is why we cannot respond in kind to the brand of politics that we are now being subjected to, and there are no shortcuts here. And I'm saying that this is the battle that we are yet to really fight with any degree of success, to be able to speak to, reach out to those who do not share our language and our worldview. Let me conclude with a very different figure, and I notice that she's right here on your wall, that of Irom Sharmila. I had the great good fortune of a few days ago of spending a little time with her. She had come to Delhi, as you all know. She had come because she was called by the Indian state because of the fast that she is undergoing against the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and she was to be presented in court for the quote-unquote crime of refusing to eat. Thankfully, the courts dismissed her case a few days ago. She wanted to meet with women's organizations and representatives in order to share her views. And I just want to end with Irom Sharmila's message to all of us. It's a pure message, a clean message. There is no question of ending her fast for the freedom of her people, even after 16 long years of being fed through a tube, living in effective custody, cut off from her world, cut off from her loved ones. It's something that I, for one, cannot even envisage. Instead, she appeals to all of us to ask, what kind of democracy, what kind of civilization are we? With what, and these are her words, I'm quoting her now sort of literally, what kind of hollow system of governance are we allowing ourselves to be ruled under? If someone like her can speak like this and yet live with hope and conviction for change, how can we not join her and believe the same? Thank you.